Hi, everyone. Happy Sunday evening. I just wanted to give you a couple of updates on where the class is and some information about material you can use to better your answers for the weeks coming forward. So, week one is always a bit of a trial for both you and I. I understand that getting the hang of a new course, especially for people who haven't taken a history course or a liberal arts course in a long time, can be a little challenging. So week one is really meant to get your feet wet. In grading and in looking over everyone's responses, I'm somewhat lenient in week one, but that doesn't mean I don't have high standards. I really expect a lot from everyone in this class, and that's why I can't emphasize enough. The worst thing to do is really to procrastinate. I have the app on my phone that shows me when submissions are coming in, right? And so it's never a good sign when at like 4:45 or 4:55, I'm getting like of the 23 people in class, 10 or 12 of the submissions roll in at that moment. It normally means people have waited to the very last second to get their material done. So I can't emphasize enough building a weekly schedule that works for you. I know everyone's got jobs. Trust me, as you'll notice in about a week's time, I'm going to be a little bit lenient on submissions. A little bit less is going to be due. I'm getting married. I was supposed to get married before this class started, but with the global pandemic, that was thrown totally into chaos. So we had to push back and everything. And I'm getting married in just over a week's time. So trust me, I understand entirely what it means to be busy. I'm also moving from Florida to Georgia. There's a lot I've got going on. So I totally empathize. Goodness, Sunday nights. I totally empathize with all of you who are doing a lot this summer. Trust me, I know what it's like. But what I do in order to really cope with everything I've got going on is build a weekly schedule. I know when I'm trying to get everything done for you. And as you notice, I get feedback to you quite quick. These were due on Friday, and I had your grades posted by Saturday. And I'll promise to always be as prompt as possible, also when replying to you. I think I've been pretty good. So, what exactly can we do to get better? Some of you look at your grades and say, yes, good, okay, this is what I wanted. Some of you are thinking, it's okay, but I could do a little better. And some of you are like, uh-oh, I've really got to pick up the pace. So what can I suggest to do better? Well, there's a couple of things. First, let's talk a little bit about the weekly responses. The primary source discussions. We'll start with primary source, and then we'll move into the weekly discussions. So the primary source discussion this week, or past week, week number one, I had you compare the Tower of Heaven, right, that you can find in Beijing, China, with the Sistine Chapel from Rome. And if we just fast forward quickly, let's take a quick look at what we're doing for this week, week number two. Your primary source discussion has you look at a painting from colonial Spain. So you're really going to be focusing on this painting from colonial Spain that depicts a colonial Spanish family of a mixed race. And then I have you comparing it with this painting from the colonial Dutch colonies in the Americas. And so you're going to be comparing two paintings of different families. Now, the important thing that some of you picked up on, only a handful, look through each other's responses. I'm not going to tell you who did it best. I want you to try to figure it out. But what a few of you did, like I said, just about a handful of you did. Sorry, I'm clicking around like crazy here and I'm clicking the wrong thing. But what a few of you did from this primary source discussion is a couple of you recognized that the key for primary source discussions is figuring out what the major theme of the week is and relating the primary source discussion to that theme. I don't just pick primary sources willy-nilly. I'm not throwing a dart at a dartboard and saying, yeah, we'll look at that and we'll look at that and there's no connection, right? Absolutely not. Our theme for week number one, if you couldn't get it from the textbook, from my lectures, from all of our readings, but our theme was empire building. Right? And the weekly response, which we'll talk about in a minute, and I've got a sample for you, the weekly response asked you to discuss how empires were built differently. We were looking from the perspective of conquered peoples, right? But how were the Spanish Empire in the New World? How was that built differently than the Russian Empire in Siberia? or the Qing dynasty in China, or the Mughal India, or the Ottoman Empire of the Middle East. All of those empires, even though they began at roughly the same time, right around the turn of the 16th century into the 17th century, all of these empires were being built, but they were being built differently. And the best answers to the weekly response really brought that out. The best answers to the primary source looked at religion not just as a cultural facet, right? Religion isn't simply something that's particular to different cultures. It actually plays a major role in empire building. And some of the best responses to this primary source noted that the Temple of Heaven is not just kind of this beautiful religious space for people in the Chinese Empire of the 16th, 17th century, but it's also a sign of imperial power. One or two, possibly three of the responses really noted that. You know, if you go to the Temple of Heaven, you would sit there and think, wow, our emperor really has this kind of divine power on his side, and look how he's manifested in this temple. A lot of you noted that the Temple of Heaven was a meeting place between earth and heaven, right? And a place where the emperor could really designate himself as the chosen power. Fast forward to the Sistine Chapel, right? Even though we have a totally different religion, right? We jump from a Taoist or from a Confucian type of religion to Roman Catholicism, which is what the Sistine Chapel is, the heart of Roman Catholicism. And you have a very different religious structure, right? Obviously, a lot of us are familiar with Christianity. It doesn't have that much in common, at least superficially, with Far Eastern religions, although there are some commonalities. But one thing that you couldn't help but notice is if you were to visit the Sistine Chapel, you would be kind of in awe in the power and the majesty that's created there. And if you read closely about how the Spanish, who were Roman Catholics, built their empire in the New World, conversion of native people, and later African people, is going to be very paramount to how the Spanish build their empire in the New World. So the best answers in these responses thought to the major theme of the week, empire building, right? They were able to recognize that empire building was the major theme of the week, and then took the primary sources and related them to the major theme. And that's something you want to do for week number 2 as well. So then where else can you do this? Obviously, in our weekly response, I'm asking you to somehow talk about our major theme. And so what I've got here, weekly response, I don't want to talk about it too much, but I do want to point you in week number 2 module, the very first thing here is a sample response. I made an anonymous student who scored very well on the first response. Read through this student's response to the first weekly question because it's an outstanding response. You'll notice it's a bit longer than what I asked for, and one thing I want to emphasize is that in no way, shape, or form is quantity more important than quality. This is a quality response through and through that also happens to be a bit longer. If you write a bit more, I'm never going to penalize you for that unless you make me read like 20 pages. Then we might have to talk. But writing a bit more is never going to hurt you, although it's not mandated. So long as you, this is 1 to 2 pages. So if you can write a very thorough response in 1 page, I mean, by all means, go for it. But take a look at this weekly response. It asked, like our weekly response question asked you to compare how subjugated people, right, conquered people, experienced empire building. And this response is fantastic because it walks us through all of the empires that we looked at in the chapter, gives us reference to the text, and ties in important information from the lectures as well in order to build a response that says, listen, empire building wasn't the same no matter where you went. Subjugation might have been similar. That is, people were conquered, but conquered people were treated differently in, say, China or Mughal India than they were in the New World, right? The Spanish came to the New World for God, glory, and to get rich. And the native people were subject to Spanish will, often mercilessly, right? If they didn't convert, if they didn't turn in the profits that they were supposed to, they could be executed. Mughal India, for example, is totally different. The Mughals practiced Islam, but they didn't force the Hindu majority of India to convert to the Islamic faith. They allowed the Hindus to continue their practices so long as taxes were maintained. They didn't force cultural immersion in the same way that the Spanish did. And this response takes us through all of the empires to demonstrate to us that if we're responding to someone who says, all people are subjugated the same way, well, that's inherently not true, right? The answer is more nuanced than that. There's levels of difference. So why does this matter, right? What am I taking us through? Well, in week number 2, we're focusing on, as you can see, there's 3 lectures again, and the 3 lectures are a little bit different. The first lecture takes us to give us a bit of a look at the Indian Ocean world. We're going to be examining how economic colonialization, trading post empires of the Indian Ocean world sprung up. First, the Portuguese, but later the Dutch and the Spanish in the Philippines. We'll look a little bit about the Indian Ocean world. But then lectures 2 and 3 look more specifically at the transatlantic slave trade that created the Atlantic empires of the New World. One thing that there is in common, whether you're in the French colonies, the Spanish colonies, Portuguese colonies, Dutch colonies, or English colonies of the New World, all of them inherently relied on the slave trade. So what was this transatlantic slave trade? And very importantly, as I get to in lecture number 3, and very important for week number 2's response, what are the enduring legacies of the slave trade? And given what's going on in this country right now, this probably couldn't be any more pertinent to the modern day. Your week number 2 response asks you to explain to someone who thinks that slavery is entirely in the past why they're incorrect, right? What can a historical understanding of slavery and the social construction of race, how can this help us understand continuing discussions about racial segregation in the United States and across the world? This isn't a U.S. history class, so I kind of note at the last PowerPoint slide how the social construction of race, right? And I talk about this in the 3rd lecture. The idea that race is not inherent, right? The transatlantic slave trade, which began around 1500 and continued right up until almost the 20th century. The transatlantic slave trade helped cement the idea of race in the minds of people of the Atlantic world, right? Colonizers and colonized both came to view race as very important to a person's status. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, though, there was not the same formulation of race in mind. And I talk about this in lecture number 3, but slavery predates transatlantic slavery, right? The Romans, the Greeks had slavery. Some people even consider feudalism in Europe to be a form of slavery, although that's not entirely correct. But the difference between all of those forms of slavery and the transatlantic form of slavery was that transatlantic slavery was inherently based on race, right? What defined someone as slave or free was the color of their skin. So week number 2's response asks you to talk about what are the long-term ramifications of that, right? And we talk a little bit about how racial construction was different in Latin America than it was in British America. And so, kind of thinking about how these differences in social construction are very important. So the weekly response asks you to talk a little bit about how race was constructed and what the long-term ramifications of that are, right? Again, talking about your primary source, we're again talking about race. A little bit more about colonial, comparing racial construction in Spanish colonies with Dutch colonies. And so you want to pay attention to that social construction of race, right? The main concept for week number 2 is the social construction of race, at least in lectures 2 and 3. There's also a podcast for you to listen to. Now, I don't necessarily have any specific questions relating to the podcast, but the podcast comes from a very important historian who talks about what happened after the British abolished slavery. And they abolished slavery in 1832, right? So about a little bit more than 30 years before the United States will abolish slavery. The British will abolish slavery. And what happens when the British in the Caribbean abolish slavery? What happens to enslaved people? They don't just go from slave to free. There's this indenture process, and there's kind of a long, drawn-out freedom cycle for people in the Caribbean. So it's an important podcast when you're thinking about the social construction of race. Please feel free to tie that in to your primary source discussion or to your weekly response. You've also got the PDF version of all the slides that I talk about in the lecture right here. Don't forget your learning curve and summative quiz, and that should just about do it. Everything's due by 5 on Friday. I'm also going to give you a video shortly this week about your first paper assignment, which isn't due for a little bit. Anyway, look forward to reading from you.